Fantastic. Thank you so much, John and Gary, for that wonderful presentation. And again, to everyone in our audience, please do feel free to keep sending your questions across as we get underway here. Looking forward to the questions on the back of this session. So first question I'm going to put across to yourself, Gary. Considering Udemed rollout with early voluntary modules, what should manufacturers be doing now?
Hi there, Emily. Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that manufacturers need to do, actually a couple things, in the interim while we're waiting for the modules to start, is to make sure that they've done a complete review of their portfolio and make sure they understand the various classes and how they're going to approach the timing requirements. And in some cases, a particular device might fall into the legacy category, and they have plans to continue to place that on the market. In other cases, they will need to switch over to the MDR regulation and make it compliant for the MDR. So come to mind, all that group of class 1s, the self-certified class 1s, would need to be MDR compliant in May of 2021. So that is certainly a pretty significant task, the clinical evaluations and so on. The other thing that you want to make sure is that you have already contacted a notified body that has European connection and designation for MDR and IVDR. So some of those other notified bodies that didn't meet that qualification yet, you certainly want to see that you're lined up. And the other thing I'll mention, Emily, is in this particular scenario is the Udemed Actor module would be available in December 1 is the scheduled timeline. So making a connection there, getting your company registered and applying for that single registration number, which would then flow into some of your documents for SRN and so on, so or for your self-certification. So a lot to be done and a lot of activity that can be done in the background before the modules open officially. But during this voluntary period, coming beginning of the year in Actor module in December, there's some connections that I would highly recommend.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Gary. I've got another question here, and I'm going to pass this one over to John. How do the EU UDI data elements match up with US UDI data elements?
It's a good question. Ultimately, the major difference you're going to notice is with the EU having the basic UDI device grouping and some of the recall data sets. Overall, there's roughly twice as many data elements that you're going to have to deal with for the EU versus US. There's some different attribution requirements for similar device info. So for example, storage and handling information. So it's very important to review all the attributes for all the regions as additional regions come online beyond EU and US to ensure they understand the definitions of those attributes and the harmonization or perhaps lack thereof. The Commission does have the data dictionary available on their website. So if your organization has not had the chance to take a look at that, strongly advise looking at that, and you can see the full scope of the attributes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And I think, John, I'm going to throw this one over to you as well. What has been learned during the Udemed testing phases that you could share as guidance for the production environment?
Number one thing I would say, ensure you have a process to deal with change. So we are still haven't experienced the exact instance of the Udemed UDI module to be able to fully test that. We expect that at the end of February of 2021, which would reflect what would be in production in May 2021 for voluntary usage. So we are aware they're still developing. There's still some tweaks being made. The documentation itself isn't complete, so it lacks some detail. If we look at our experience to how we went live with the FDA, there was quite a flurry of changes initially in 2014 once the initial go live occurred. So you have to be prepared for change. That's the most important thing in my opinion. We do expect that according to the Commission's roadmap, it appears to at least be planned to be stable once voluntary submissions go into place in May. But, plan for change, for sure.
No, honestly, I think that that's actually a key theme that we get across every conversation and every year, and maybe something actually we'll delve into. I'm going to take note here, something else we can look into next year, more effective change management, because I don't think it matters the process you're dealing with. If you can effectively and efficiently manage that change, it obviously sets you up for greater success moving forward. So thank you so much for that answer as well. Gary, I've got another one here for you as well. What are the grouping requirements for the basic UDI-DI? So risk class, intended use, etc. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we actually get that question a lot, Emily, where a manufacturer needs to approach this two-level hierarchy, and it's really the first time they had to do that. So the whole idea of this basic UDI-DI, and I'll refer to it as Buddy as a nickname, but the Buddy DI was a concept that kind of hit industry by surprise. So the FDA has no equivalent hierarchy and grouping that the European Union came out with, and it caught a lot of industry manufacturers and so on by surprise. So there are some guidelines about how to group the particular items in your portfolio, and the grouping is really assigned to the manufacturer. The manufacturer has to establish this hierarchy. A medical device coordination group has put out some guidelines about how you go about do that, and when things are changed, what has to be created with a new buddy, and some of the guidelines about that. So I would refer those to have questions in this area to go over to the guidance document and read some of the details. But in summary, the concept is that the basic UDI-DI is this family group, and it's used inside the Udemed for identification and sorting and filtering purposes. It does not appear on the actual product label at all. So it's kind of this virtual identifier that is primarily used inside Udemed. So you won't see it on a particular product package at all. Now, the criteria for creating a buddy is centered around the certification and the particular marking and approval and risk class and so on. So all the devices that are connected to a particular buddy have to have a number of common characteristics. And they would include the legislation type. So you might have a buddy that is for a directive, or you might have another buddy that is for the MDR. And inside those particular categories, all those devices would have the very same legislation characteristic. But it goes beyond that. So the risk class, if you have a class 3 or 2A, class 1, and so on, you would need a dedicated buddy for each of those classes. And then it goes further. There's a number of clinical investigations that are done, and if they're applicable for that particular group of devices, then a device can fall into that category. But if you have different clinical investigations that studied a different intent and a different purpose, then you would need to have a dedicated buddy for that as well. Again, certified activities by a notified body, all that activity needs to be lined up for a particular buddy. And again, if it's a different CE mark and so on, then you'll need to create a different buddy for that. There are some other characteristics. We won't go into the list, but on one of the previous slides, there was probably a dozen or so characteristics. If the device is implantable, or if it's measuring, has a measuring functions, or if it's has some animal tissue in it, connected with that particular medical device, or if it's a near patient testing type of device. So you can go back and look at that field, and as long as you understand the basic common elements that are at the grouping level, then you can approach your portfolio and start to create these buddies. And then inside each buddy have the individual devices assigned. And then there is a linking that needs to be reported. So if I have 100 devices I would need to link each of those 100 devices back to the one common buddy. And if you go to one end of this pendulum, it can be very granular, where you only have a few or even one particular device inside a buddy group. And at the far end, depending on your particular set of products, you could have actually all your products inside one buddy. So, you have to figure out somewhere in between that is a good fit for your company, and then meet, the criteria of having common elements for all those devices that are inside a buddy. Sorry for the long answer, but we get this question so often, I thought we'd hit a little bit more details there.
No, really appreciate it. And again, thank you for giving that detail, because it certainly saves all the follow-up questions as well. And it's really, really good for people to have that practical assessment to take back as well. So I've got another question for both of you here. For China, will we have to obtain GTINs from GS1 in China? What are your views on that one?
John, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yes, and within, I do have a link that can be provided. I don't know if that could go out as well as part to the attendees. But there's information on this from the GS1 on the GS1 website. It has to do with your China GTIN filing procedure for non-GS1 China company prefixes. So ultimately, there's not a requirement to have GS1 China GTINs. It's if non-GS1 China GS1 company prefixes are used to create GTINs for products, keywords here, made and sold in China, their use must be filed with GS1 China. Again, this is for products made and sold, made in China and sold in China. So those are important factor there. And again, we have there is information on this on the GS1 website, which pasted a link in the answer thing, but we can see if that could get out to the attendees.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, John. Oh, sorry, after you, Gary.
Can I just add another quick comment to layer on top of that? There is some information that each of the issuing agencies, the approved issuing agencies, would need to make reports back to China NMPA regarding the activity for, I think, on an annual basis. They need to make these reports indicating what particular companies have engaged them. And therefore, there's this reporting by the issuing agency. So GS1 China would definitely be in the mix there to report any companies and so on back to NMPA. So that is going on in the background. The question was a little bit different in that where do you actually get the company prefix? So there's this other activity that each of the issuing agencies need to report annual reports back to NMPA for those companies that have engaged them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that additional background, Gary. Much appreciated there. Another question here. Is it your perception that global harmonization might be stalling because of the proliferation of ever more complex local requirements? So definitely interested in your thoughts on this one.
So I'll make a quick stab at that. There was a dream at one point in time when UDI started to be kicked around that there would be a common database, a common set of identifiers, and basically one source of truth around the world, that it would be truly global. That quickly evaporated with the FDA coming out very soon after the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum put some guidelines out, and I think it was going on simultaneously, actually, where the FDA was putting their particular implementation in place. And the FDA included a number of regional data elements and some regional policies about how to implement UDI. So it started to, even on day one, with the first FDA implementation, be a little bit regional as compared to the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum guidelines. And then the trend actually continued. So the European Union had a number of specifications that come out. And again, a lot of regional activity The whole concept of a buddy, for example, was introduced, and some of the policies about handling UDI were different from the U.S. and also different from the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. So John and I and others certainly around the industry have seen various agencies roll out their specifications. China, South Korea. Now we have some information from some of these other, Singapore and Saudi Arabia, and now Australia is coming aboard, and so on. And there is a little bit of common elements, but not a whole lot. In some cases, it might range from a dozen to 24 sort of thing of common elements. But there's always this aspect of regional information. So I think that at best you might get some harmonization with some fields and some terminology and policy. I was actually encouraged to see that Singapore would be accepting those labels that were compliant with the FDA or EU. So there you get some leverage, if you have that as a starting point. So there is some commonality there, but there's a lot of regional specification and rules that we're seeing. So I don't think we're going to have a nice, clean, single, one global approach, unfortunately. It will be many regions, and each is going to have their own set of rules with a little bit of common data elements and policy that might be shared, but it's going to be like a precedent. It won't be a cookie cutter implementation from an existing implementation at another region. So, John, what were your thoughts? You've been watching as well.
Yes, I agree. I believe that there is some stalling there. Like to see more harmonization, at least amongst even those common attributes and the new DI triggers. That's always a focus point, is to ensure that's at least common. But you're correct. You're going to have local requirements, because at the end of the day, when they're implementing their UDI databases, they're also trying to improve some things on the end of the health authority as well. So you'll start seeing some things that make sense to them or help them, not necessarily from a more of a global data, device data management perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for that answer. And again, thank you for giving such clear detail, of course, to all of our audience. Mindful of the time, I'm going to finish with one more question. But again, to everyone in the audience, do please feel free to keep popping those across. I'll certainly circle back and provide answers on the back of the presentation. But a final question here. Do we need UDI for integral drug device combination products?
Yeah, so let me answer that with first of all, from the FDA point of view, there are some very nuanced rules about how UDI is applied to combo products. So in some cases, if the combination product has the assembly, the high-level combination product itself was reviewed, and the primary mechanism of action was a device, then CDRH would have been the approving and reviewing department. And in that case, UDI would apply at the very top level. An integral medical device component inside that big assembly, large assembly, would not have to have its own UDI, but the UDI would be applied at the high level assembly. On the other hand, if that particular combination product was reviewed by, for example, CDR, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, now most likely that'll have an NDC number, a National Drug Code number for the high-level assembly, and inside of that could be a device component. And then there's some other special rules about whether or not it's a single entity combination products. So a nice example would be like a dermal patch that you might put on the surface of your skin. It has a drug in it and also has a physical device component. In that case, a single entity component, it would not have to have a UDI on the medical part, or the medical device part. On the other hand, if it's a kit and it might have multiple items and they're co-delivered together inside the combination product. So maybe now you have a syringe and you might have a vial of a particular drugs product. In that case, the medical device component does have to have a UDI. So, Emily, it's really nuanced where you kind of have to look at it on an individual basis, but there is some guidelines from the FDA about how you apply UDI to the medical device component inside a combination product. And similar type of analogy in the EU. So each one has a little bit of a nuanced set of rules that you need to follow.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Gary, for that answer. And thank you so much, John and Gary, for joining us this afternoon and giving us such an informative presentation. There's so many clear takeaways for all of us there. So really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.